Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Thank you to Invika for inviting me to the SymfonyLive London conference. It's the first time I'm in London, and I'm very excited about it because it's a great city. I just spent one day walking around, and I love it. I mean, really. So welcome, and thanks for joining my talk. As Tony said, I'm talking about Puli, the latest project of mine. For those that, I had added some introduction to my slides as well, since I wasn't aware that Tony would introduce me so well. So I'm Bernhard Schussek, or Bernhard Schussek, that's the way you pronounce it in German. It's a great international name. It's very easy to remember, very easy to spell. Really, people almost never get it wrong. Anyway, I'm a Symfony core developer since 2009, as Tony said. Fig representative for 2 years now. And my latest project is Puli, which I started about 1.5 years ago. You know me by the nickname of WebMozart, so you can follow WebMozart on Twitter. I'm a PHP trainer and coach. If you have any requirements in that regard, visit my website, which is pretty new right now, and get in touch with me. So follow WebMozart on Twitter if you don't already, and you can see all the updates about Symfony and Puli that I'm doing. So what is Puli? How many of you have heard about Puli before? Not so many. All right, I prepared a little video about Puli so that you can. Let's see if I get some sound.
Max, you're killing me.
Hey, everybody jamming. Hey, man. She jamming? They jamming too. Can a brother get a Bud Light, man?
For the great taste that won't fill you up and never let you down. Make it a Bud Light.
So you might be wondering how the hell this is related to Puli, right? I'll tell you. So Puli is this dog that you saw in the video. It's a Hungarian dog breed, which is pretty awesome because it looks kind of funky when it runs. You hardly ever see its eyes. I find it incredible that it's actually able to see. And it's very important in Hungary. It used to be used for herding sheep, and it's like the national animal of them. So that's actually where the name comes from. Like Puli my sister had a Puli, which was a dog. And it was such an amazing animal that I thought if I create a project that I'm named after that animal, I'm always thinking about that dog when I'm working on the project, which kind of motivates me a lot, right? It's kind of a nice thought about thinking about that project and thinking about this cute dog. But of course, I'm not talking about dogs today. I'm talking about PHP development. So old school PHP development, early 2000s, used to be something like this. You had an application, and basically you wrote everything yourself. You knew all the code that you wrote perfectly because it was you. Today, we're not doing that anymore, fortunately. Since we had Composer, we're using more and more third-party libraries and third-party code in our applications. And the benefit of that is the more third-party code we use, the easier it is for us to write applications, right? The more we can reuse, the quicker we can set an application up, the less code we have to maintain, the less bugs we have to fix, right? So that is essential for writing applications nowadays. So I'll say reuse of existing high-quality packages is key to success. So Composer basically is a dependency manager. Composer installs the packages, it checks all the dependencies of the packages that you want to install, and installs them as well. And it builds an autoloader so that you can autoload all the classes that you have in all these packages in your PHP code. That's all it does. Let's see how that looks. More or less, the Composer package is like a directory on your file system that contains some PHP code. And a composer JSON file that tells composer how to install that package and how to resolve the dependencies of that package. Pretty simple. In your application, if you lay it down, it looks something like this. You have composer packages at the bottom that you install using composer, like a translator package or Twig or some block module or whatever. And then you have your domain logic of your application on top of that. And in between, you need some kind of layer to integrate the packages. So when I'm talking about integration of packages, I'm talking about something like this. You have a translator from a translator package, and now you need to tell the translator how to find, for example, message catalogs in your project and in any package that you have installed. So you're making sure that one package, a translator, works with your application and any other package that you use. Another example is Twig. If you use Twig in your application, and now I'm assuming that you're not using Symfony or some ready-made framework that already supports all that integration stuff for you. But if you use, for example, Silex, and you don't use the service providers, or you build an application from scratch, then you would be doing that, right? So if you use Twig, then you create like all the classes that you need from Twig, you configure them, and then you tell Twig where to find all the Twig templates that you're using in your application. Again, in your application and in any package that you use. Same thing for dependency injection. You have a dependency injection container that's just like, that's not the Symfony dependency injection container, but just an example. And you need to tell the dependency injection container how to load your services and how to load the services of all the packages that you have installed. And all of these things are what I call package integration, right? So if you do that manually, that's a lot of work. It's a lot of things, a lot of lines of code that you need to write in order to integrate packages. And in the worst case, every time you install a package, you have to integrate that package with all the other packages that you have already installed. That's just a theoretical number, but it can get pretty complex if you build bigger applications that reuse many packages. So we don't want to do a lot of work. Developers usually are lazy. Who's lazy in here? I am, definitely. I write code because I'm lazy, because I want to make things quicker tomorrow. So I spend an insane amount of time today to make things easier tomorrow, which doesn't make sense so much. But we're lazy. We want to have something that simply works. We want plug-and-play packages that we can install in our application and that work without doing a lot of extra work, right? So I'd say like minimum effort, like one click to install, like a WordPress plugin, you install it and blah, 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 and it just works. That's something that I would like to achieve. So frameworks solve that problem using framework-specific packages. So in Symfony, you have bundles, for example. In Framework, you have modules. In Type 3, that's called extensions. Drupal, it's called modules as well. So every system has its own package concept that basically tries to solve these problems. Framework packages look very much like the composer packages that I showed before, except that they usually contain PHP code and maybe resource files. That would be CSS or JavaScript or Twig templates or anything that is not PHP. And usually this PHP code and the resource files need to follow some conventions that are specified by the project, by the framework. So for example, in Symfony, a Symfony bundle usually has some kind of extension class for the dependency injection container. Then you have this resources directory, which must be exactly in the root directory of the package, of the bundle, and which may contain specific subdirectories for specific types of files. And they must be named this way by default. You also have this bundle class, which is used to initialize the bundle, basically. So these are some conventions that we use in Symfony and that you need to follow in order to write a bundle that can be used in a Symfony application. But it can't be used in any other application, at least not easily. Like if you have a Drupal application, you can't simply install a Symfony bundle without doing extra work. If we lay down the application, it looks very similar to before. We still have all these composer packages on the bottom. We still have our domain logic at the top. But now we also have the framework in the middle. The framework basically is a standard toolkit, a selection of tools that we can use, and a set of conventions. So if you use a framework, you use a framework because you want to make it easy for everyone on your project to work on your code following the same conventions and following the same style of development. And the framework is also doing all this package integration stuff, so it makes sure that if you install a package, and if you install multiple packages, that they work together. Now, if we look at packages, you all know packages, this composer repository, then we see that there's a lot of different kinds of packages up there. We have libraries, which are simple, sets of PHP code that we can simply use in our application. Then we have Symfony bundles, of course. There are type of 3 extensions, Laravel packages, send framework modules, lots of different kinds of packages. And now, if you're a Symfony developer, all that you really care about of all these packages are basic libraries that you can use and have to configure yourself, and Symfony bundles that are ready-made to simply install them in any Symfony application. But all these other packages, like Laravel packages or send framework modules, aren't really useful to you because you can't really use them easily. If you're a send framework developer, that's very similar, except that you use a different subset of these packages that you have on packages. If you don't use any framework, then it gets much less. So we have a problem currently in the PHP community of very high package fragmentation. We have all these sub-communities working on different code that is very often doing the same thing. If we look in packages and we just search for Twig, we find a Twig bundle, we find a Twig module for send framework, we find a Twig integration for Yi, which is another framework, for Lithium, many more. And you see, all these things, all these packages, these framework-specific packages are basically doing the same thing, but for different communities. And all these communities waste a lot of time and a lot of effort on solving the same problems. If we look at what all these bundles and all these framework-specific packages do, then we discover that they're basically doing very few things, and they're all doing the same things. So one thing that bundles and modules solve is accessing resources in packages. If you have a Twig template, you want to have some way of finding that file and using it in your application. So in Symfony, you all know that you have the colon notation, bundle, colon, controller name, colon, name of the template, right? That's the way we use in Symfony to access templates in our bundles. Another thing that frameworks do is publish resources, or assets, as we usually call them. If you have CSS files or JavaScript files in your package, then you want them in your public directory so that users can load them when they open the browser. So what Symfony does, and you know that, is when you run publish assets, or assets install, actually, it copies all the files from your public directory to your web directory, right? So that it is published. Once you publish all these assets, you need to have some way of generating the URL of these assets. That's also something that all of these frameworks solve. Then another use case that they do is to load specialized resources. So I gave you the example of message catalogs for translator packages in the beginning. You have maybe multiple packages, multiple bundles that contain translation catalogs, and Symfony needs to load all of them and pass them to the translator so that it can use them, right? Same thing for specialized classes. If you have classes that implement specific interfaces and you need to load all of them from different packages to, in this example, configure the dependency injection container there needs to be some way of discovering these classes in these different packages. That's something that these frameworks do. Symfony does that. Many more frameworks and projects do that in different ways. So they're solving all the same problems in a different manner and in a manner that is not interoperable. We still have these different sub-communities working on their own thing. So that was the reason why I started working on Puli about 1.5 years ago. I thought that PHP needs a unified tool for solving these problems, to reduce all this wasted effort and all this duplication that we have in the PHP community. And the result, Puli, is exactly that. If you look at Puli, or a Puli package, it's not so different to what I showed you before, to what a Symfony bundle is. We still have a directory with PHP code and resource files. We still have a composer.json file that tells composer how to install the package and how to resolve all the dependencies. But then we have an additional file called puli.json that explicitly configures the conventions used in this package. So the Puli.json file tells Puli where to find Twig templates, where to find CSS files, where to find JavaScript files, where to find specific classes that implement specific interfaces, and many more such things. And in this way, any project that uses Puli is able to install Puli packages. Effectively, we decoupled the package integration layer from the framework. So we have Composer at the bottom still, Puli in the next layer. So any package that supports Composer and Puli can be used with any framework that supports Puli, right? And the goal of all of that is to make it possible to install packages simply by running Composer install or Composer require, and nothing else. Ideally, packages are automatically set up with your framework if you do that. So if that becomes possible, then in the next step, it will become possible to write high-level packages like a blog module or a web debug toolbar or a profiler or something like that that works with any kind of framework. That's something that you can never achieve today, right? So I'm going to talk a bit about Puli's details, about the way Puli works. Basically, Puli is a set of components. So you have your application that actually uses a few Puli components. Here I showed you the repository discovery and URL generator component. I will be talking about them later on. And then you have a command line interface that reads the Puli.json files in your package and all the packages that you have installed, and uses another component to configure these components used by your application. All right, so let's look at this a bit more in detail to get a better understanding. First thing I want to talk about is resource access. With Puli, you can access resources. That means any file that is not a PHP class or PHP code, like HTML, Twig, configuration, anything really, by so-called Puli paths. A Puli path starts with a slash. It basically looks very much like a Unix file path. And if you look closely, then the prefix of that path is the name of the Composer package that contains the file. So Puli paths consist of this path prefix that is mapped to some directory in a Composer package. And by convention, the prefix is exactly the name of that package. Then if you follow the path, the rest of that path is simply appended to that mapped location, and in this way, Puli is able to find the file. So if you know how class autoloading works in PHP, it's very much the same thing. You have some namespace prefix that is mapped to some directory somewhere, and if you load a class, then the autoloader will just look through all the matching directories and try to find the file. It's the same thing here. It's very simple. You do the configuration, you do the mapping with the Puli command line interface. There's a Puli map command. You pass the prefix that you want to map and the directory in the current package. And this command will add the path mapping to a puli.json file in your current package, right? So it's very simple. Now, by convention, for applications that you don't share with other people, you can simply use the prefix /app. So that is basically the equivalent of using : in Symfony, right? Global files, you could say. And that's much shorter. It's very easy to write. These Puli paths are integrated in different tools and can be integrated in different tools. For example, there exists an integration for Twig that lets you use Puli paths in your Twig templates. So instead of using the : notation in Symfony, you use a Puli path. And if your Twig template that contains this code is loaded through a Puli path, you can make it even simpler and just use relative paths. And you see, since these paths very much look the same like a Unix file path, you can use them just like them. Puli takes all the mappings in your packages that it finds in all these puli.json files and combines them to build the Puli repository. The Puli repository is something like a virtual file system you could think of. And it contains all the files that you mapped through the path prefixes. You can use the Puli command line interface to browse the repository, to discover it, to find files, to just list the tree, to get a better view of what the Puli repository looks like that you have. And technically, the Puli command line interface uses the manager component to build a data store during build time, so you do that once. And at runtime, this optimized data store is used to find files mapped to Puli paths. That means that in runtime, it's very efficient to use. There's this optimized data store, which can be like a JSON file or a cache, like Doctrine cache or something like that. And all these Puli JSON files in your packages are not used in production at all. And ideally, Puli is not used in production at all because you're using a cache. So in Symfony, for example, if you have Twig templates, these Twig templates are converted to PHP, as you know. And in this case, Puli wouldn't be used at all in production, which means it's very, very efficient. So right now, I use it in production on a smaller site, and there's actually no performance difference to when you're using Symfony's native system, except when you're warming the cache up. That's where you have a little overhead, but that's it. All right, that's it. In general, if you have any question, please just raise your hand. I'm happy to answer questions during the talk, because very often questions come up while watching the slides, and I'm happy to answer them. Probably all your neighbors have the same question as you do, right? Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is overriding resources in packages. So a common use case that you have when you use packages is that you want to customize content that these packages provide, right? For example, if you use some kind of blog module that you install in your package, and let's say this blog module contains a post template for displaying a single post, and some kind of generic layout with HTML tags and the head and all that stuff, then usually you don't want to use that generic layout in your application. You want to customize it and use the layout that you designed. So the question is, how can we customize this layout file that is in that package without actually changing the code of that package, right? If we change the code of that package, the next time we run composer update or composer install, our changes are lost. That's why we can't do that. And with Puli, that's very, very simple. You simply copy the file to your application. You customize it, or maybe you already have that file. And then you tell Puli to override the file in the package with your own file. If we look at the setup from before, then you heard But you learned that we have two Puli JSON files. You have your application that maps the prefix /app to the resource directory, and then you have a block package that maps the prefix Batman block to a resource directory. And now adding the override is nothing else but adding another mapping. You can add the mapping /Batman block to your application to some directory that will contain all the overloaded files. And Puli will recognize that this prefix is already mapped by some other package, and remember that your application overrides that block package. And that means that any file that is found in here will be used preferred over the files found there, right? Both directories will be merged. You don't need to copy all the files from the resource directory to that block directory. You can just override specific files that you want to override, and Puli will just merge them. On the command line, it's very much the same as before. You call Puli map with that prefix and the name of a directory. And Puli will add the path mapping from that prefix to that directory. And also remember that your package overrides the other package that defines the same mapping. And it's a very, very simple but very, very useful mechanism. Because you can have packages that override other packages which override other packages. So in Puli, that's called a package graph. You have all these packages which can override each other, and it's very flexible. You can use it really for theming systems or stuff like that. It's also possible to use that override graph in your own application if you want to have some custom behavior that, like, where packages can override each other. You can just access Puli's override graph and reuse that. And that's it. That's pretty much how you override resources in other packages. It's a very simple mechanism, but it's very, very powerful. Are there any questions to that? OK. Next, I want to talk about URL generation of resources. So very commonly, your packages contain some sort of CSS or JavaScript code, and you want to generate the URLs for where these files are placed in the end, right, on the web server. With Puli, the way you do that is, like, one way to do that is to add some kind of public directory to your resource directory. You can name that any way you like, but naming it public will make it easier for everybody else to understand. And you just place all your public files there. It's the same thing as in a Symfony bundle. It's nothing new. I didn't invent it. And then you have the resource URL function in your Twig template that you can use to generate the URL for those public resources. You simply pass the Puli path to the function, and the function will generate the URL for you. Again, it supports relative paths, so it's very convenient to use. I also plan to support the same functionality in CSS, but that's not working yet. That's not implemented. But then in the end, you could use some sort of resource URL function in your CSS file or SCSS file or something like that, pass the Puli paths, and while converting the files with gulp or something like that, those resource URL virtual function calls would be transformed into actual CSS URL statements with the actual URL. And that's very useful because in this way you decouple the templates that contain your HTML from the configuration where the files will be placed on the server in the end, right? To actually generate the URLs, we need to tell Puli where the files will be located on the web server. So we're going to add a web server to the configuration. This is something that we do in the root package in your application. So for example, if you have a project and you have some public HTML directory, in Symfony that's the web directory, right, which contains all the code or which contains the document root of your web server, then you can add a server to Puli that is mapped to that directory. This is just an arbitrary name that you choose. In this case, I chose localhost. You can name it any way you want. It's just that you have some identifier for referencing that server later on. And the next step that you do is you call Puli publish with some directory in your Puli repository and the server that you want to publish that directory to. And as soon as you called that command, Puli publish, the URL generation will work, because Puli knows that all the resources in app public are published in the document root of localhost, so it's able to generate the URLs accordingly. Again, it's a very, very simple system. You can also map resources to subdirectories of the localhost, of the document root, by adding the name of that subdirectory or like a path as the third argument of the Puli publish command. And then you will see that here we published all the files in the Batman blog package to the subdirectory blog. And when we generate the URL for those files, we actually have the /blog leading up to that file path. It's a very simple way of generating URLs for files and assets in different packages. And it gives you, the application developer, you, the user of different packages, the full power over where your assets are going to be installed on the server. Something that in Symfony you don't have, because all the assets are by default installed in /bundle /name of the bundle, and there's no way for you to change that. You can also add URL formats, or you change the URL formats to add some sort of static versioning, for example. So here, I'm changing the server localhost, I'm changing the URL format. You see that this is a simple printf string with a %s. This is just the location of the resource on the web server. And here we append version 2. That's a very simple versioning mechanism, which is not always what you want. But just for demonstration purposes. And now, every time that you generate the URL, this format will be used to generate the URL. The same works if you want to generate absolute paths, like include the domain. You just change the URL format, then any URL that is generated will contain that domain. The architecture in the back is very much the same as we had for resources before, resource access. During build time, when you run the Puli command line interface, Puli builds basically a store that is used by the URL generator. And during runtime, that optimized store is used by the URL generator to generate URLs. And again, if you use cache, then Puli is not used at all. So there's no performance penalty. Any questions about that?
I have one.
Yeah. What was that?
Back in.
Yeah.
How does it work with, for example, CDN content where you may have multiple domains?
Yeah.
So,
very good question. That's the reason why you can configure servers. You can configure another server for your CDN, call it CDN, and pass some kind of like SSH location or something like that, and configure the URL format accordingly. And then any resource that is published to your CDN will use that URL format configured for the CDN. So you can use like multiple CDNs at the same time for different types of resources, for example, or different locations. Yeah. Good question. All right. Now that we were talking about generating URLs, we still need to know how to copy the resources or the assets that we have in different packages to those locations that we just generated the URLs for, right? That's something that I call resource installation. In Symfony, you have assets install, which does just that. And in Puli, there's very much the same thing. The command is called puli publish -- install. And what it does is it uses all the mappings that you configured before and installs the files in the corresponding locations. So here we mapped /app public to the document root. So a symlink is created there, and we mapped all the assets from the Batman blog package to the subdirectory blog. And the install command does the same thing. It creates symlinks if it can, and if it's able to, and if like it's a Windows system, it just copies the files over there if it is not able to create a symlink. And that's it. As soon as you ran this command, all the URLs that you generated will actually work. Now, obviously, Puli is not the best tool to install assets because there are so many more use cases that need to be solved, like SSH upload or using rsync or something like that to push to a CDN or somewhere else. That's why I want to install this -- install command from the final version of Puli and move that functionality to some gulp or grunt plugin instead, so that when you run gulp watch, anytime you change a resource, all the transformations that you have in your gulp file already will take place, as well as the resource installation that you configured for Puli. And that's it. There's really nothing more to resource installation since you did all the configuration in the step before. Any questions? Okay. Now I'm talking about the, I think, most exciting feature in Puli. At least from my experience, and I need a volunteer for that. So, Konstantin, what about you? Welcome on stage. Yes. So Konstantin will be a package developer. Today, you can walk over there. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's something that you usually don't do, right? But today you will be like acting as if you would. Okay, resource consumers and translators. Let's assume we have different kinds of packages, like your application, then a block package, and a translator package. And let's say that translator contains some sort of translator class with a message loader that loads, message files, XLF in this case. And then we can have XLF files in different packages that are loaded by this loader. And the question is, how can the loader find the files in the different packages, right? So in the beginning, I showed you can do that all manually. You can just pass the paths. You can also use some framework that does it automatically. But we want to use that or solve that in a generic fashion. So the way that Puli does that, it separates packages in resource consumers and resource providers, right? So the resource consumer would be the translator package developed by Konstantin. Thank you very much for developing this awesome package that is able to consume XLF files. And then I'm the developer, thank you very much. And then I'm the developer of a block package that contains an XLF file. I'm the resource provider. And now Puli's job is to hook these packages together and make them work without having you, the user of the package, do additional, coding. And the way this works, Konstantin, as the developer of the translator package, defines a binding type. That's just a name, Basically, it's just a string that Konstantin chooses. The string is started with the vendor name of the package so that it's clear who owns that binding type, and that in order to prevent naming conflicts. And then some sort of name for the resource that Konstantin wants to discover. So here it's /catalog. It's just a string. And then Konstantin is able to use that binding type to discover all the resources that match that type and use them in the translator package and load them, right? Now, Konstantin is publishing his package. He's writing documentation, of course, as all of us are. Sorry, can't stay serious with that. And he's publishing that binding type through catalog in his documentation. He says, oh, my package supports Puli, and if you want to publish or if you want to include such a package in your packet, such a file in your package, you can bind it to this Thor catalog binding type, and that will just work. I'm reading that, and I'm thinking, oh, that's great. I want to use that. So I'm writing my Batman block package with this messages en XLF file, and I'm binding it to Konstantin's binding type. And now, as soon as any of you installs those two packages, they will be wired together more or less automatically. So the way this is done is Konstantin defines a binding type with the Puli command line interface again. So there's the Puli type define command for defining a new binding type. You see it's simply added to puli.json. And then he will be using the discovery service of Puli to discover all the bindings from people like me, people that develop packages that contain resources that match these binding types. And then he's able to load all these resources. I won't talk about these double loops here, why they are necessary. It's not so important right now. But he will be able to access all the resources bound to the binding type and do something with them, get the body, right? I, as a provider, will use the Puli bind command to bind individual files or globs to the binding type published by Konstantin. Again, this is added to my puli.json file. And now you, as a user, only need to install both packages, create the translator from Konstantin's package, create this Puli message loader that Konstantin included, pass Puli's discovery service, and that's it. All the other stuff is already handled by me and Konstantin. You don't have to need to worry about that. So as you see, all the work of package integration is moved from you, the user of the end application, or from the framework to us, the authors of individual packages. That's a pretty big change. Thank you very much.
Coming to you in the next version of Translator.
So internally, Puli takes all these bindings and all these binding types it finds in the different Puli.json files of different packages and wraps them in this discovery component and makes them accessible this way. The way this works is the same thing as you saw before. Use the Puli command line interface. Puli builds a data store that is very optimized. And then during runtime, this data store is used, and you have very little performance overhead. All right. Any questions about resource discovery? There you go.
Is it possible to bind resources inside another package in your application? Like if the package author doesn't know about Puli or doesn't know about...
Yes. The question was whether it's possible to bind also resources from other packages, like not the one that you have. That's totally possible. You can just bind any Puli path to any binding type. And if it's found, then it will be bound. If it's not found, it's simply ignored. Actually, if you type like Puli bind on the command line, you will see that certain types or certain paths weren't found and are simply not used.
Okay, great.
Does that mean you can use packages that do not support Puli by default?
Right, exactly. That's, for example, I will be talking about the Symfony bundle later on. The Symfony bundle, not the Symfony bundle, the Puli bundle for Symfony is kind of an integration package for Symfony application that adds resource mappings for other Symfony components because they don't support Puli yet. So you can write your own meta packages until those packages natively support Puli.
And when they do support Puli, you need to just remove the...
Right, you can just remove it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
The last feature that I'm talking about is very short because it doesn't exist yet. But that's service loading. The general idea is that you have classes in your package that implement specific interfaces, right? For example, this extension class. And now you want to publish these classes in your package so that other packages are able to get all the classes that implement that interface and do something with them. So one use case is something like the dependency injection component that uses extensions from different bundles or different packages to configure the dependency injection container. And with Puli, all these packages would be able to publish their dependency injection extensions, and the dependency injection container would use Puli to simply load all these extensions. An exciting thing about this and about resource discovery in general is the way it opens up new possibilities in the future. For example, I showed you this translator example before. It's kind of tedious because if you develop a package and the package contains some kind of message catalog, you have to bind it to all the binding types of all the different translator implementations that support that, right? But with something like PHP Fig, the framework interoperability group, it becomes possible to create PSRs with generic global binding types or global interfaces. And that anybody that supports that interface in his package is able to bind resources or classes to those fig binding types or interfaces. So it creates a whole new level of interoperability between packages, not now, not in a year, but maybe in 2 or 3 years, that will change the way we develop with PHP very much, I think. Any questions about that? Okay. So to finish my talk, I would like to have a very, very rough glimpse at what PHP development will be in the future. I think this will change a lot. Composer changed the way we develop packages or the way we develop applications with PHP a lot. I think Puli will be not as drastic, but it will be another quite big change to our community. So with Puli, as I told you, it becomes possible to write plug-and-play packages. Simply install them with Composer, and they more or less work. Puli acts as a mediator between these different packages. And installation of packages becomes very simple. For example, if you install Twig, and if Twig supported Puli, then the installation would be something like Composer require Twig, and then you would instantiate the Twig environment with a Puli loader, pass the Puli service there, and that's it. Any package that contains Twig resources exports them and can be used, right? So installation of packages and configuration of packages becomes that simple, really. If you install a package that supports Twig, you just need to Composer require that package. And since that package exports or defines Puli mappings, it works. You don't need to tell Twig where to find the Twig templates in that package because you already did, or the author of that package already did. And by removing the need for additional framework-specific packages like bundles or modules, and instead having some generic concept of Puli packages that work together independent of the framework that you use, we can reduce the community fragmentation a lot. We can start working or stop working on these different concepts for different target audiences. And we can stop being in our silos, like community silos, and working just for our target audience, but we can start being one big PHP community and working on great stuff together that is usable for anyone. So instead of installing some Twig extension or bundle or module, in the future you will just install Twig because there will be no such thing anymore as an extension or bundle or module, right? We don't need it anymore. Which leads to much less duplication, more collaboration, more possibilities to work together on great stuff. And I think that's very exciting, so I think that's cool. Talking about the current status of Puli, I told you that I started developing like 1.5 years ago. Since then, some people joined, and a few people are using it in production, actually for very big systems. It's very useful if you build a big application that contains many packages that have to interact with each other in some way. Then it's very useful to use Puli. But currently it's still in beta. So I don't recommend you to use it in production. Some people, as I told you, do. They're very adventurous. They also take into account that they have to update or change the applications. But the feedback so far was great, and also the experience was very, very exciting. The possibilities that are opened by this tool are really, really, changing the way you think about developing. At the moment, I plan a stable release for 2015. It's like a very rough schedule because this is a side project that I do and other people do. And it depends very much on the feedback that we get and on people that join us and help us, working on small things. There's extensive documentation. You can go to docs.puli.io. Actually, puli.io does not work yet. It just redirects to the documentation, but I'm working on a website that explains in very simple terms what Puli is and why it's useful for you. I hope to launch that website in the next few weeks. It's used successfully in production, as I told you, but I don't recommend you to do the same unless you really know what you're doing. And there's a working Symfony bundle that you can use to just test Puli in your Symfony application. So this bundle is very unintrusive. You can use it, you can use existing Symfony behavior and functionality, like those column notations, and you can also use Puli paths side by side. So it's a very good means of just experimenting and playing around and see how it feels developing with Puli. There's even a Symfony distribution, the Symfony Puli edition, that you can use to just check out how an application looks like when it is configured to be used with Puli. Actually, it's just the bundle that is installed and maybe some configuration changes, but not so much. And at the moment, there are a lot of projects that consider supporting Puli out of the box. So obviously, since I'm a Symfony core developer, I would like to maybe have Symfony 3.1 supporting Puli out of the box for different bundles. But there are also other projects, Typo 3 and Neos, like two big content management systems, want to use Puli in their next releases for managing their extension systems. Then Elcody, which is similar to Cilius, which is an e-commerce platform from Spain. They want to use Puli to manage their plugin systems. And maybe your project as well. I also talked to Taylor Otwell from Laravel and to people from the Sand Framework community. They're all very interested in Puli about, removing code from their projects and just using one interoperable tool to solve their problems. So I think that can be very exciting. If all these projects adopt Puli and then work together, that will change many things. Of course, I need your feedback. I want your feedback. So please head over to Puli.io, read the documentation, follow Puli PHP on Twitter, which gives all the information about latest developments. Actually, that IRC channel doesn't exist anymore. Instead, there's a GitHub channel now. I forgot to update the slide, which is github.im/puli/issues. And I think you can find the link to there somewhere, probably on a Twitter account. All right, and that's it. Please get involved. Please, if you're excited about that, check the issues, join our channel. Talk about it to your friends and your colleagues. And maybe help if you have some spare time. My name is WebMozart. Follow me on Twitter if you want. Please, please, please rate my talk. I would be very happy about that. So it's 14974 on Join In. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. Are there any questions? Well then, thank you very much.